So let's talk through the many and varied monsters and bioforms of the Tyranid hives, with the strengths and weaknesses of every Tyranid's unit in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do a big overview of Tyranid units in their Codex in 40k 10th edition, roughly going over each unit in the book with some of its positives and weaknesses, and a rough and very arbitrary score out of 10 for how strong I'd rate them in game at the moment, and a little bit of justification for each why I've chosen to rank them like that. Tyranids have a big unit pool and rather a lot of units to choose from, so let's jump into it quick. We'll talk through each infantry unit first, then move on to monsters, and then talk about any other special characters and heroes that we've not mentioned as we went along. First up, let's start with the Endless Multitudes, and first we have the Termagants, the chittering masses that make up the bulk of the Tyranid battle line, whittling down the foe with weight of numbers, though they still pack a punch with their flesh borer guns. There's nothing like an alien parasite burrowing into you as a nasty way to go in 40k. Termagants are a battle line infantry unit for 60 points for 10 or 120 for 20. A cheap swarms with a 5+ save, and out of their weapon profiles I'm probably most convinced about the Spine Fist at the moment. Their Twin Links rule and hail of shots means that they can punch up a bit better than those with other things and still fire in combat, which is quite a big deal when you're fighting over midfield objectives. They've got good OC, so can put a lot of weight on points if they can get there and survive, and the reactive movement can be genuinely quite impactful if the enemy moves up towards them, and then they could either hide away or shy away from a charge or position better on an objective. They've got quite a bit of usable support as well, have a nice easy healing stratagem in Invasion Fleet, plus lots of support in Unending Swarm where they really excel, and could work with a Tervigon if you wanted to. For weaknesses, they've got low damage output against anything with either high toughness or high saves. The toughness for them isn't maybe super standout, and it's maybe not too hard to get to good anti-horde firepower with just a bit of incidental firepower in 10th edition, and bigger units will be vulnerable to blasts. Compared with the other swarms, they're a fair bit slower moving, which doesn't really work in their favour. The Tervigon's not really considered enormously overall strong right now to actually make them genuinely dangerous against heavy hitters and things. Ideally, you'd probably want to have them have synapse if possible, so they don't risk letting you down on objectives at a key moment. Still though, handy enough troops I think. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Not too bad to have a few of, but maybe not particularly stand out outside of Unending Swarm. Next up we have the Hormagaunts that jump into battle with their characteristic bounding leap, siding the foe apart with their siding talons. These guys are another Endless Multitudes unit with 65 points for 10 or 130 for 20, and I kinda like the melee version of Termagants really. 3 attacks at strength 3, AP -1 that does do really quite well against light infantry, and unlike the Termagants they move really quite fast indeed, both being able to move 10 inches just at base and also getting advance and charge, which is really quite big. They can be making some very long charges across the battlefield. Otherwise they've also got good OC, and like Termagants have good synergies with replenishing swarms in Unending Swarm or Invasion Fleet. Again though, they just can't really handle tough targets that well, low damage against anything toughness 4 or higher with good saves, and have less support access compared with the Termagants, where they don't even have things like the Tervigon to support them. Still though, not the worst for fast moving objective control if you want a bit more melee, and they would work better with Unending Swarm as well, where the core rule could help them get a bit closer if needed. I've also chosen to rank them at a 7 out of 10. I feel like perhaps their main issue is competition with gargoyles. Speaking of which, these winged Tyranid swarms strike from the sky, and are one of the first organisms that get seen en masse when a planet gets invaded. The enemy's auto-defensive batteries being overrun by sheer swarms of these things, attacking with flesh borers and their characteristic blinding venom. There's 75 points for 10 of them, or 150 per 20, and these guys are a battle line infantry squad that seems to crop up in just about every competitive Tyranid list. Fast-moving swarms with Endless Multitude and OC2 are the fly keyword and built-in deep strike, so they could drop onto the board and threaten to do secondaries. And the thing that really sets them apart is that move shoot move ability that they have, meaning that they can just go incredibly fast between their movement characteristic and that, or drop in from deep strike and then get to move closer to the enemy, maybe doing things like swiping objectives or reaching places that should have been screened. You could do nasty things like that, like big first turn move blocks by spreading a screen of them across the board, or doing jump shoot jump things where they move out, shoot and then hide again. They can take a winged prime as an attachment to add a little bit of melee threat, as well as being well supported in Invasion Fleet and Unending Swarm. They're rather nice with the rather scary Vanguard Onslaught as well, as they have the Vanguard Invader keyword. For downsides, they do have very low damage output with just their flesh borers, and are both a bit pricier and easier to kill compared with termagants and hormagaunts, but overall it seems to be a price worth paying. They do objective work better than anything. Overall, I've chosen to just about give them the full 10 out of 10 here. In competitive army lists, they seem to be a choice that you really can't go wrong with 1 or 2 units of. Finally, for the swarms, we have the Neurogaunts, 45 points for 11 of them, or 90 points for 22. These guys give you some very cheap gaunt bodies with a little bit of OC. They still have 1 each, and that's not bad when they cost effectively less than 5 points per model. And are genuinely really quite a powerful board control unit. You can cover a lot of space with these guys for really not that much investment at all, and their durability per point really isn't bad at this very cheap points cost. Their other ability is to spread synapse around a little bit, and they can add as a Neurotyrant's bodyguard if you want to. The downside of this though is that they basically don't really have any damage output. Just a single attack hitting on a 4+ at strength 3 in close combat isn't really going to do anything meaningful, and they're kind of questionable as a Neurotyrant bodyguard as well, given that the last flurry of attacks that hit them when the unit gets wiped and you start taking damage on the Neurotyrant means it could take a whole bunch of damage at toughness 3, which wouldn't be ideal. Overall, they definitely have their use. They're genuinely good board control for the cost and could fill up the backfield or just be cheap expendable screens, but overall it's helpful to have swarms that can actually damage enemy infantry. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10 due to that. Moving on from battle line, and for some of the very smallest Tyranids around, we have the Rippers. They're just 20 points for a single base, and that's the way that I'd field them. Again, for board control per points in 40k, it doesn't really get too much better than that. There's a lot of value in just very cheap units, even if they do nothing, and particular ones that can deep strike. They're pretty excellent for secondary scoring, as they could pop up to do things like engage on all fronts or deploy teleport homers and things. They can still do that in spite of their OC 0. You do get a good enough number of wounds for the cost, meaning that the opponent's going to have to fire at least something meaningful at them if they want to remove the base, and they have the potential to worsen enemy OC on primary objectives in a pinch. In general, they wouldn't really do any significant damage, might kill a light infantry model or 2 if you're lucky, but in general, just for individual deep striking bases to do secondary objectives, you can't really go too far wrong. Again, I feel like 1 or 2 units in an army list is rarely going to be a bad idea, whether they're just doing screening or secondary objective work. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10 as a result. Next up, and moving into some bigger infantry units, we have the Tyranid warriors. First up, we've got the ones with the melee weapons for 85 points or 170. These guys hit you with mass twin links damage 2 attacks, 6 attacks each at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2. Genuinely, that is a lot of damage coming at you, and a maxed out squad of these should be enough to wreck the vast majority of infantry units in the game. Though it really will struggle against vehicles where you might be wounding on a 6+, even the full wound rerolls there only go so far. They're a unit with access to some good synergies. You can have the Winged Prime lead them for some sustained hits, and giving the squad Vanguard Invaders or enhancements. Their special rule does add a little bit more extra damage and defense if needed, and they can provide some somewhat cheap synapse to the army. Perhaps their biggest problem is their defensive profile, which, while it isn't awful, is definitely on the squishy side for the points cost. Basically, any weapon profile in Warhammer 40k will be at least fairly effective against them, whether it's anti-tank damage or small arms, and that's not really a good place to be in. It means that they struggle to be the big damage dealers on the front line that they'd ideally want to be. They're also not really all that fast for a dedicated melee unit, so are probably going to be taking damage before they get to combat. And as mentioned, when they get there, Twin Linked helps them a lot against big tough targets, but still wounding on 6s can be pretty painful. Overall, not really quite where they need to be, I think. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. Needs a bit more raw power, really. Otherwise, I'd say it's a kind of similar story for the warriors with the ranged weapons. They're significantly cheaper at 70 points per 3 or 140 per 6. They're really quite cheap if you want an objective holding infantry unit that does synapse, and as the name suggests, their damage is split between ranged shooting and melee, where they can get some free, slightly heavy Tyranid biocannons thrown in. They're a solid amount tougher for the cost as they're so much cheaper, and again they can use the synergies that the melee warriors can have, like the Winged Prime. Perhaps even more so than the ranged warriors though. They really struggle to deal with harder targets out there, only having the massive majority of their attacks damage 1. Maybe less tempting to build around as damage dealers as a result. A bit of a different role unit, actually being a bit tougher for the cost and cheaper if you want minimum size units. Kind of different role to the melee warriors right now. I've chosen to also rank them a 6 out of 10 accordingly. Next up, we have the infiltrating vanguard of the invasion, sent to sow dissent among enemy populaces, and they're the Gene Stealers. 85 points for 5 of these, or 170 per 10. These guys are fairly fast moving, scouting 8 inches up the board, and then having an 8-inch movement and charging after that, potentially delivering first turn charges if you want to. When they get there, their chosen targets are maybe a little bit limited, a whole bunch of strength 4, AP2 and damage 1 attacks that chew through hordes or standard space marines quite well, but will struggle to punch up against tougher things. The Broodlord can make the unit a lot more of a general purpose threat, adding his own damage 2 attacks and devastating wounds to the Genestealer attacks. Their durability isn't as bad as it used to be, with 2 wounds with their 5+ invulnerable save, and they perhaps feel particularly tempting in the Vanguard Onslaught as they have the keyword. They're a big and fairly threatening unit that's a good choice for the stratagems there, maybe a bit more capable of tangling with tougher and more elite enemy units than some out of the roster. For downsides, I'd say their damage and defense is merely okay to mediocre. They're definitely paying a premium for their big scout move, and they will struggle to threaten heavier things. They do have competition with Lictor variants for midfield board control units as well. Generally, Infiltrate tends to be a bit more powerful as opposed to scouting, and Tyranids have tons of good infiltrators. Overall, I've chosen to just about rank them a 7 out of 10. Probably towards the lower end of that, or 6 out of 10 for things outside of Vanguard and Onslaught. Probably towards the higher end, or pushing towards an 8 if they are in Vanguard Onslaught, when they're just so much better due to the keyword access. Moving on, we've got the Raveners, 75 points for 3 or 150 per 10. These burrowing Tyranids can undermine the enemy army, appearing unbidden within their ranks. They're basically fast-moving Tyranid warriors without the synapse when they're on the board, 10-inch movement, a whole bunch of attacks at strength 5, AP1 and damage 1 that can blend hordes rather nicely, and they can deep strike and then return to the reserves later in the game, which could mean that they're an interesting choice for jumping around doing secondary objectives later on, if you're not filling that role with things like Biovores and single deep striking Rippers. They get to choose either having a 4+ save or some extra strength 4 thorax weapons at close range, both of which I think have their merits. For downside, strength 5 and damage 1 means that they won't be worrying heavy units or things with lots of wounds at all. Their toughness isn't really all that great, even if they are a bit cheaper than the melee warriors. They're only OC1 and no synapse, unlike the Tyranid warriors, and secondary scoring in general might be a bit better done by Rippers and Biovores, as opposed to having these guys burrow around. Overall, I definitely don't think they're unusable. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. Probably a unit that might make sense to have one of, though I probably wouldn't go more than that. Kind of a shame that they don't get either Harvester or Vanguard Invader. Next up, we've got the Biovores, 75 points each, and a rather big and chunky infantry unit. Backfield Tyranid artillery support, where one on the board can chuck out a Spore Mine a turn, which can be really quite powerful for scoring secondary objectives in-game, landing them to do things like behind enemy lines, and they can be really quite nasty first turn as well, maybe popping one down on a midfield objectives to prevent opponents using an advance move to get onto those points. That can be kind of big to give a chance for denying a primary objective. Otherwise, if it makes sense, he could flex to using its actual damage output and a little bit of ignores line of sight firepower with devastating wounds, perhaps a last-ditch effort to take down something injured towards the end of the shooting phase. They're kind of unlikely to die when they're hidden as well. They've got enough durability to protect them from enemies that can jump around behind them or hit them with out-of-line-of-sight weaponry. As for weaknesses, they're not really very efficient as actual damage dealers for the indirect fire purpose point of things. Their main value is the spore mines, and only one of them can do that each turn, so it usually makes sense to have one but no more. Still though, for that role they're absolutely excellent. Very easy to include just one of these to hoover up the secondaries and do a bit more spore mine disruption while maybe sitting on a primary objective. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the big and chunky Pyrovore, 30 points per model and 1 to 3 in the squad. They're really massively tanky for the amount of points they cost. A huge 5 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save is great for 30 points, and just having access to very cheap single units of them is rather nice as well. They can be good screening placeholders to just zone out the enemy, or go into strategic reserve to maybe do secondary objectives. They also have genuinely fairly good damage output for the cost as well. That big twin-linked flamethrower will chew through enemy lighter infantry very well, and can be a threat for Overwatch if it's going to be punchy enough to make a difference, or finish off something injured. They do have the Harvester keyword for Assimilation Swarm if you want it as well, so if you're using that formation then these guys are basically mandatory. For downsides, they don't have any significant melee or way to fall back and shoot if locked up, so if the enemy cares too much about those flamethrowers, they could just charge them to tie them up. They are really quite slow moving when they're on the board, They've got a big money cost for actual point and model that you put on the board, given that they're so cheap, and just for sheer practicality in game, they do have a fairly enormous base for how many points they cost. They'll take up a fair amount of your deployment zone, and it might make the units interact a bit awkwardly with terrain, even if they do have the infantry keywords. Still though, I feel like these guys are pretty excellent. One or two of them is rarely going to be a bad pick, just due to their utility. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Barb Gaunts, absolutely terrifying to infantry in early 10th edition, though a bit more tame now. They're 60 points per 5 of them, or 120 per 10, and they fire biocannons that scatter enemy infantry with shards of shells. 4 units with blast in 40k, these guys are really quite efficient. Their mass blast attacks get 1 blast shot per every 12 models in the unit, and that can add up to a ridiculous amount of extra shots if you're against a 20 model horde or something. Their damage output against infantry is genuinely really quite good for the cost. On top of that, they get to slow down 1 infantry unit with a -2 to their move, advance and charge, which can be a big way to keep some slow enemy elites out of melee potentially. If they do that and cause a little bit of damage into the bargain, they've likely done their job. Otherwise though, they're not really a unit that you'd want too many of. The damage isn't really very general purpose, and they're not really often seen as a particularly needed unit within the Tyranid army. They do feel like a bit of a luxury buy if you want to counter certain enemy infantry. Could be useful if you know that you're likely to be going against something that they work well against. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. They do have their uses, but definitely a long way from where they were at the start of the edition, when they were both cheaper and had that ridiculous special rule that could slow down loads of squads. Next up, and perhaps one of the losers of the balance update, were the Hive Guard. They're 110 per 3 or 220 per 6 of them, big chunky tough infantry that are really quite tanky, high saves, high toughness and 4 wounds apiece. They do get fairly good overwatch, hitting on a 4+ if they're sat on an objective marker, which could make them a reasonable target for a 1 CP spend there. But unfortunately I feel like almost everything else is kind of against them. Their damage output when shooting really isn't much good versus things like Exocrines or Maliceptors or Zonethropes. The Impaler Cannon doesn't scare much that isn't a 1 wound infantry model, and the Shock Cannon isn't even all that efficient against vehicle targets, given its AP -1 not working so well against things in cover. They're slower moving than some of their rivals, they're weak to getting locked up in melee where that can cancel their damage output, and they don't even have that much OC. Overall, I think it's rare that these guys would ever really be considered the best choice for their role. I think you're usually better off with a shooting monster instead. I've chosen to rank them a 3 out of 10. Moving on, we get to the Tyrant Guard, a 95 point or 190 point bodyguard unit for the Hive Tyrant. They can also guard the Swarm Lord or the Neuro Tyrant if they want to. Like the Hive Guard, the main thing that they bring to the table is being very tough for the cost, 4 wounds, toughness 8 and a 3+ save. They're there to make a Hive Tyrant a little bit harder to kill, and maybe particularly interesting in a couple of the detachments. In a Simulation Swarm, they can be really quite a big and chunky model that you could resurrect due to their harvesting, and perhaps in Synaptic Nexus they could make you for a really big and chunky Synapse unit to allow you to use stratagems on, adding a bit more weight to a single Hive Tyrant. In general though, for the most part, when people do choose to use Hive Tyrants on foot or the other units, they usually don't run Tyrant Guard alongside to protect them in competitive lists. In general, it seems that their defense just isn't really quite worth the extra cost that they are, and they don't really bring all that much more extra damage to the table. As well as flexible with a few different options that you can bring, you don't really get that many attacks and they don't hit all that hard. They move kind of slowly at 6 inches alongside the Hive Tyrant, and their 5+ feel no pain special rule that they give the Tyrant that they're protecting usually isn't that big of a factor, as it wouldn't matter against anything besides precision, and precision usually isn't good enough to take down that kind of target. Overall not really unusable in the right detachment, but for the most part people seem to just take the big cost of the Hive Tyrant and play occasionally with terrain with it, as opposed to stride forward and tank damage on these guys. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Spore Mines and the Mucilid Spore, currently costed at a level that means that Games Workshop really don't want you to play these in terms of models that you've bought in for the points. 55 points for the Spore Mines or 50 points for a Mucilid. These guys serve as cheap deep strikers, which again could do things like secondaries, but you've got rippers and things that could do that way cheaper, and otherwise their only other real advantage is preventing the enemy advance. In theory that could hold back a flank of an enemy army a bit more than it otherwise would do, but doesn't really seem worth the price of entry at 50+ points really. Perhaps the most disappointing thing about them is their damage output. If and when they do explode, they're likely to do less damage in mortal wounds compared with how much the mines cost in the first place, which is a bit weird really, given that they're not really all that easy to actually trigger it to explode in the first place. They are spectacularly easy to kill for their cost if the opponent can target them with anything, only being toughness 1 without a save. Overall, I really wouldn't bother with these if you could put the points towards pretty much literally anything else in the Tyranids Codex, Rippers if you want deep striking things, or particularly a Biovore that could spawn out essentially 5 different units like this over the course of the game for 75 points. That does seem like so much of a better value. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 1 out of 10, terrible damage and defense, and easily outcompeted on utility by other choices. Next up, we've got the Spore Cloud creators of the Venomthropes, enshrouding their nearby Tyranid brethren in a shroud of toxic spores to prevent the enemy from seeing them. They're 70 points for 3 of them, or 140 per 6, though I'd usually take 3 as that's all you need to access their special rules, giving an aura of cover to nearby Tyranids, and then an aura of stealth to anything that isn't a monster, which I'd say out of the 2 rules is probably the better of the 2. Cover's not really all that hard to obtain, particularly for bigger things like monsters, but stealth is really quite good. As it goes, they're relatively tough for the cost at 3 wounds and toughness 5 with stealth. I think 70 points isn't too bad to cover the heart of your army with these sorts of durability boosts, and they are actually kind of threatening against light infantry and melee, with lots of mass anti-infantry wounding on a 2+. For weaknesses, they won't really be threatening anything else besides infantry with their damage. They've got diminishing returns after 1 unit, don't really do anything against melee-focused armies where their debuffs won't matter, and as mentioned, cover isn't the hardest to get on the board anyway if you're careful with terrain. Still though, a single unit seems absolutely fine, particularly in a more infantry-focused Tyranid force. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, we have the Tyranid Zoanthropes, the Tyranid Psycho Brainbugs that ominously float forward, borne aloft by psychic energy, and shielded by unnatural protection. These are infantry with 110 points for 3 of them, or 220 per 6, blasting out the enemy with their psychic lances. Each unit of 3 either gets 3 las cannon style shots, or a bunch of blast attacks that are quite good at killing space marines or medium infantry. Otherwise, they do have quite a lot of fun side benefits. They provide synapse, they provide nearby Tyranids with a weak invulnerable save of a 6+, their own 4+ invulnerable save is handy to help keep them safe against hyper AP attacks, and they do have a small chance to drain mortal wounds from enemies nearby due to battle shock, which could pair well with a Neurolictor. Otherwise, they get on well with Hive Tyrants for advance and shoot, or maybe the Synaptic Nexus for the big focal reroll stratagem that could potentially have more than 1 unit of Zoanthropes do some laser focused damage against 1 hard target. It's definitely not all good news about them though. Their defense is kind of so-so, even with the invulnerable saves, and very vulnerable to damage 3 attacks in particular. Being pretty slow moving and having fairly short range isn't the greatest combo in the world, and despite being Tyranid damage dealers with access to strength 12, which not that many get, it seems they are outcompeted by Exocrines and Maleceptors for Tyranid shooting in most people's lists. These guys certainly aren't fielded in the same sort of numbers that they were towards the edition's start. Overall, definitely not awful though. I'd rate them an 8 out of 10 for psychic shooting on the battle line. Maybe more tempting in Synaptic Nexus versus most. Next up, we've got the Von Ryan's Leapers, essentially smaller pack hunting lictors that were new in the Leviathan box this year. 75 points for 3 of these, or 150 per 6 of them. They're an infiltrating unit that starts in the midboard, and when they engage in combat, they'll be hitting first with the fight's first ability and swing with mass damage 1 attacks, quite good for chewing through lighter infantry and maybe things like basic space marines that will struggle with harder targets. Their defensive profile isn't awful as they get stealth on top of a sort of Tyranid warrior kind of profile, and they do get more wounds on the board compared with things like the lictors, though there's definitely some trade-offs with them. They're particularly interesting in the Vanguard Onslaught, having big units of them being good targets for stratagems, and they do have quite a lot of board control early. You could use these to sort of pin back the enemy in their deployment zone. Otherwise, for weaknesses, lacking Lone Operative is a big disadvantage compared with the other good lictor choices out there. The Heroic Intervention rule is kind of a niche one. You might be able to set them up to protect another unit, but they're only going to be enough melee threat to do so against the kind of lighter targets the opponent might have. Strength 5 and AP 1 doesn't really damage things that are say toughness 10 or 2+ saves, and leadership 8 on a forward deploy more isolated unit maybe isn't ideal. Still though, interesting enough overall, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Next up, we get into the Lictor variants. I thought we'd go through the Tyranid lone operatives in general, including Death Leaper and the Parasite. Lictors are the infiltrating stealth organisms that precede an invasion, striking from the undergrowth with chameleonic scales, blending them into the environment when they're stationary. A standard Lictor is a 60-point lone operative, so can't be shot greater than 12 inches away. He's quite a good general purpose brawler. He fights first if you charge him and gets 6 attacks, with a big strength 7 AP 2 and damage 2, so quite good at killing space marines, and has precision on those for taking out characters. He's fairly chunky for a lone operative at 6 wounds at toughness 6 with stealth, and then has either the option to infiltrate forward like the other ones, or can do rapid ingress for free, which could be quite good to have them emerge from the sides of the board and then threaten a long charge on something they wouldn't otherwise have been able to reach. Otherwise he gains some CP for killing characters, and all the Lictor variants really like Vanguard Onslaught of course. I say that this guy's main weakness is competition with Death Leaper and the Neurolictor, both of which are kind of about as good as it gets for Tyranids in my opinion. Both of those getting a 4+ invulnerable save on a lone operative unit is kind of crazy, and makes them so much harder to kill than this guy. Rapid ingress might be a bit more useful in some games than others, though I suppose you could maybe switch it up and forward deploy if necessary. It does feel like more of an alternative option versus infiltrating, as you can't do both. Overall really quite solid though, interesting lone operative that just got competition. I'd rate him an 8 out of 10 overall. Otherwise we've got the mental manipulation Neurolictor, whom infiltrates forward and gives the enemy hallucinations and shields himself from the view of their mind. For a forward deployment unit, maybe starting on midfield objectives, the Neurolictor is standout tanky, 7 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save and toughness 5. Definitely a profile that can be a risk to try and kill for units that you bother to move within 12 inches of it, and really quite good for 65 points worth of cheapness. His damage output isn't what the Lictor's is, being significantly less strong and only 1 damage, not 2, but instead he gets battle shock tricks, handing out a single test to a unit within 12 inches of him. That happens in the command phase, so it can be kind of big for how many objectives are controlled there, and then for any units that he does manage to battle shock or get shadow in the warped, those get -1 to hit, and also your Tyranids get +1 to wound them, 2 very meaningful buffs, and it can be pretty excellent if he's scrapping over midfield objectives with things. He works well with anything else that can cause battle shock tests as well, Shadow in the Warp, the Neuro Tyrant and Death Leaper as examples. Overall though, I think he's a pretty excellent lone operative. He isn't going to deal anywhere near as much damage as the Lictor, but is a pretty good support piece. The battle shock debuff could be enough to flip an objective and make it about Tyranids this turn, and the debuff thing can be pretty handy as well. Overall I have given him the full 10 out of 10. I feel like it's hard to go wrong with 1 or 2 of these to just be nuisances for the enemy and annoying lone operatives, and provide some big situational utility as well. Otherwise, completing our set of Lictors, we have the Death Leaper, 70 points, so slightly more expensive than the standard Lictor at 10 points more. Broadly has the same sort of profile as those guys, but gets a better 3+ armor save and also a 4+ invulnerable save, so it's massively harder to kill. I'd say that those upgrades and gaining an extra wound between the lot of them are easily worth the 10 points. He's going to survive some attacks that he just otherwise completely would have died to straight away. Has the same fairly good brawling fighting profile. And then he also has a rule that forces battle shock tests at -1 if the foe is less than starting strength within 6 inches of him. And that's a very good rule for making battle shock meaningful. Occasionally that could cost the opponent primary points and pairs well with the Neurolictor. He does have maybe a few downsides, losing rapid ingress, an extra 10 points cost, the character keyword having a few downsides of its own, and he can only take the one of him as he's an epic hero, but still though he does make an appearance in the vast majority of competitive Tyranid lists, and for being a utility lone operative it doesn't really get a lot better. I'd give him a 10 out of 10 overall. Finally, for our infantry lone operatives, we have the Parasite and Mortrex. He costs 80 points and has 12-inch move, fly and deep strike, so is a bit more mobile than the other Lictors, and I'd consider that his main selling point. Otherwise, he has his fun but pretty unreliable chance to spawn D3 Ripper bases. He needs to land a hit with that barbed ovipositor of his. If he does manage to get into combat with some lighter infantry, there's at least a pretty reasonable chance, but there is a pretty high chance of you failing to either hit or wound, or the opponent passing their save. I feel like if the other Lictors didn't exist, then he'd probably get played just as an interesting lone operative to run around and be disruptive. Given that they do though, and they're some of the best units in the Codex, he's pretty much in second place here I think. He costs more than any of the rest of them. His damage output is more Neurolictor or worse sort of levels, and I guess worse than that given that he costs more. He's easier to kill than any of the others with no invulnerable, and the battle shock at the start of the fight phase that he brings isn't really the best buff worth having. Overall, lone operatives are still handy for missions and objectives and things. He could be a reasonable secondary objective doer, but in general I'd take Lictors. I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10. Moving on, let's get into the Tyranid monsters, and starting out with the most iconic of them all, the Carnifexes. 125 points for one of them, or 250 per two within the same squad. Very flexible damage dealers, with a fair few wounds and a 2+ armor save. They do have lots of ways that you can customize them if you want to. Perhaps the heavy crushing claws and the venom cannon might be some of the most tempting out of their loadouts, and they get some built-in bioplasma and spine blank attacks included as well. Their special rule, blistering assault, when they take damage means they can move rapidly closer to the enemy if it makes sense to. Though I'd say perhaps their single biggest asset is being able to be joined by the rather godly old One Eye, who I think really takes these guys from being a very mediocre unit into a very good one, and it's maybe him that's adding the value more so than the base data slate here. Overall, I feel like their durability is just a bit lacking at only 8 wounds, even if they do get the 2+ save, and hitting on a 4+ means their damage output really isn't all that either. Basically, if you are taking the standard Carnifex, I would absolutely be running them with Old One Eye as well at the moment, and I feel like alone they are a bit of a letdown really. For that reason, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10, definitely appearing in competitive lists, but carried by their leader. Speaking of which, I thought we'd skip ahead once more just to talk about Old One Eye, seeing as he's the only unit that can join the Carnifexes. 140 points worth of regenerating Tyranid Rage, and compared with his charges, his stats are kind of next level, natively hitting on a 3+, giving the entire squad reroll hit rolls, so that makes the regular Carnifexes far better, as well as his own attacks. He's massively tougher per points than the standard Carnifexes, with a 5+ feel no pain built in as well. And his melee is particularly scary as well, with a whole bunch of strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6+1 attacks, absolutely capable of ripping enemy heavies limb from limb. Regenerating wounds for him is a nice bonus as well, if he does happen to get injured. For downsides, being a melee-only monster might get him screened or ignored for a turn or two. Seems unlikely he'd be making a first turn charge unless the opponent actually comes out to meet him, and that could be kind of annoying to have a 390 point unit with a couple of Carnifexes screened out for a turn. He is also competing with the cheap and effective Auspex as well. I'd probably rate Old One Eye as a little bit better than that, but still that's a monster that can cause a lot of carnage at a very cheap points cost. Overall, I'd rate Old One Eye at a 9 out of 10. Pretty dangerous, definitely sees competitive play, and makes Carnifexes go from kind of meh to kind of great. Unfortunately, the new Screamer Killer Carnifex that came out with Leviathan perhaps isn't quite on the same level as the rest of them. 170 points for a melee monster with 10 strength 10 and damage 3 attacks, plus a bioplasmic scream that can do a bit of anti-infantry work and also hands out a battle shock test. Unfortunately, I feel like the only thing that's really lacking with this thing is just the points cost. Not sure what they were thinking with making this guy 170 points where the Auspex is 125. Feels like they're two miniatures that should be kind of somewhere towards the same sort of points cost really. And even with his being particularly destructive against things like 3-wound infantry and terminators, he really doesn't have much of a niche at the moment. I feel like he could do with a very solid points cut, somewhere in the region of 20 points or more. I've chosen to rank him as a 4 out of 10 as a result. Speaking of dedicated melee bugs, next up we have the Auspex. 125 points worth of Ravenous Melee Rage, 14 wounds at toughness 7 and a 3+ save I think is absolutely fine durability for that cost, and its melee profile perhaps feels like Games Workshop gave it both the sweep and the strike profile and then didn't choose to correct things later. It gets tons of strength 7 and damage 2 attacks, backed up by a few heavier hitting shoveling claw attacks, plus some battle shock things in melee and a sniping tongue attack as a little bit of extra value. Unfortunately for it, despite I think having very good overall numbers both in terms of damage and defense, it's maybe just not quite tough enough to really survive on the very front line, and it often tends to impact the enemy units then die, or be a prime target to get focused with high power anti-tank weapons as it closes in. Being sort of medium speed does mean it's likely to take damage before engaging. As a result, they don't tend to be used massively spammed on the front line, at least not in the most competitive list around, but I feel like they're very rarely going to be a particularly wrong choice just with their raw stats. Overall, I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10. They're certainly kind of essential if you want to run the Assimilation Swarm with their Harvester keyword. Next up, we have the Armoured Psychic Brain Bug that is the Maliceptor, 170 points for some shielded Psychic Might. These guys have a similar profile, not so very far from the Auspex, but with a big 4+ invulnerable save that makes them so much more durable against high power anti-tank weapons. And for their damage, they spit out some pretty threatening close range shooting, d6 plus 3, strength 10 and damage 3 attacks with blast that's going to make itself felt on just about anything it chooses to go after. Otherwise, it does have a little bit of melee threat and has a nice damage debuff to enemies with a -1 to hit within 6 inches and -1 to wound below half strength as well. That's quite nice to have on the front line on the midfield objectives. It also provides synapse as well, which could be nice for shepherding your other Tyranid bioforms around. Perhaps its main weaknesses are being quite short ranged at 18 inches and not really all that fast, plus being locked up in melee isn't going to help it too much. It might have a difficult choice between staying engaged and firing the blast at something else and letting the enemy hit it again in close combat, or falling back and losing its shooting. Still though, it certainly seems to be one of the more popular Tyranid units to run in competitive lists. Really quite a nice tanky monster to have on the front line that packs a lot of threat. I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10 overall. Next up in the monster menagerie, we have the Toxicrin, 180 points worth of infantry killing monster this time. This guy gets tons of attacks both at range and melee with those toxic lashes, strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 with anti-infantry 2+, good against light infantry and good against standard space marines, not good against enemy monsters and vehicles which it might have to try and deal with. Otherwise it gets a disruptive chance to lock enemy in melee, though I guess you would still be able to shoot at it even if it did so, and mortal wounds after moving within 6 inches could do a bit of chip damage if it can get itself in close. Again though, even with a points decrease compared with when it came out, this thing really is still looking very overcosted. Really not tough for the cost at this sort of price tag with no invulnerable save, and having close range damage output that's just not very general purpose and can't handle monsters and vehicles isn't really a great combo, as it might not really have all that much choice as to what it gets fighting. Overall, it just compares badly with other monsters that you could take, and for cheaper points on most of them, I've chosen to score it a 4 out of 10 overall. Next up, we have everyone's favourite Librarian Eater in the Psychophage, the Tyranid tick bug type thing that seeks out and consumes the flesh of psychers to process them for the hive mind. This thing is 125 points and very easy to obtain at the moment, following the Leviathan box and the Tyranids datasets, and perhaps for its biggest wins are its durability, where it gets 10 wounds at toughness 9 but with a 5+ feel no pain, meaning that effectively you'd usually have to chew through 15 wounds on average before this thing gets brought down. That's not too bad at 125 points cost. Otherwise, I'd say the other really big draw is an aura of a 6+ feel no pain to all Tyranids nearby. It's not enormous, but it's definitely helpful, and it could affect really quite a big chunk of your army. Plus it's got the Harvester keyword for the Assimilation Swarm. Unfortunately though, that 6+ feel no pain I think is maybe a tough sell, with it basically being the only major thing that it does. Its damage output is kind of awful, a few strength 6 and AP -1 attacks, and it only really gets a little bit better either against injured things that it can feast on or against psychers where it does get some devastating wounds, but still not really enough to truly make you want to take this as any sort of counter. Overall, maybe not the most awful to have one of in a lineup of tanky monsters where it might be able to make some of them a bit tougher, and can be helpful for Harvester with the Assimilation Swarm. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10 for its raw datasheet though. Next up we have the burrowing terrors of the Morlock and the Trigon, emerging from beneath the earth, the Morlock with his desensible jaw to try and swallow enemy commanders whole. The Morlock is the cheaper of the two at 145 points. He has okay enough damage against 1 wound or 2 wound infantry, with lots of attacks at strength 8 and damage 1. And his fun special rule is that when he emerges from his tunnel, anything within 12 inches that's not a Tyranid has a chance to take some mortal wounds. Usually D3 of them, or 3 if you're lucky. If you could hit say 3 different units with that could add up to some okay damage output right there. After that though, it's not really going to be doing all that much that's threatening against enemy heavy hitters. I feel like the mortal wound hit isn't quite enough to make it really tempting at a big 145 points cost, though it is very fun. I feel like it perhaps compares poorly to the Trigon, which despite being more expensive, just brings a bit more to the table, and as such I've chosen to rate it a 5 out of 10. Speaking of the Trigon though, this guy emerges in a flurry of biostatic electricity, zapping a bunch of foes to death before closing in with its claws. He's more expensive at 180 points for the same defensive profile, and his special rule is allowing him to burrow up really quite close to the enemy, deep striking within 3 inches of them. Perhaps most interesting in combo with rapid ingress, you see where your opponent's moved on the board, and you have this guy turn up somewhere disruptively in the midfield, but somewhere where your opponent's not got line of sight to them with all their guns, and they're not going to be able to move to react after their movement phase. Then you'll be in a position to hopefully get the Alpha Strike with a whole ton of Strength 9 and Damage 3 attacks that could absolutely ruin certain squads, and just cause a whole load of problems for the opponent in their backfield, maybe netting some secondary objectives on the way if you're lucky. Otherwise though, I would say that his damage output isn't really that great at 180 points, certainly not against toughness 10 or more, and there's very much diminishing returns beyond just one of them. I might be tempted by one, but I probably wouldn't go more than that. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10, a bit of an interesting fringe pick, and I'd absolutely use him with rapid ingress. Next up is perhaps one of the most favoured Tyranid gun turrets at the moment, the Exocrine. 135 points for a Tyranid with a massive bioplasma cannon on its back. This guy spits out d6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP minus 3 and damage 3, really very good against medium infantry, can be enough weight of fire to at least worry some heavier enemies. For 135 points, I think his durability is fine, toughness 10, 14 wounds and a 3 plus save, and he can mark the way for other Tyranid shooting. Anything else that tries to shoot the target that he hit gets to reroll hit rolls of 1, so could set up things for batteries of other Exocrines or Maleceptors or things. His shooting isn't quite general purpose enough to be threatening things like enemy tanks and vehicles though, and he doesn't want to really get locked up in melee for having to choose whether to fall back or not. Still though, for a bit of anti-elite style shooting on the board, I think he's absolutely fine. I'd rate him a 9 out of 10, definitely sees a fair bit of play in competitive armies. Next up we've got the Tyranids, basically the Tyranid's version of a living battle tank. 245 points, seeing as Games Workshop cranked up the points to perhaps surprising levels, and unfortunately just generally considered a bit overcosted now it's reached that kind of price tag. Even at this kind of cost, despite losing its -1 damage special rule, I still say that its actual defense is kind of fine with 16 wounds, toughness 12 and a 2 plus save, pretty comparable to things like a Space Marine Land Raider, and its new special rule, while not being quite as good as the old, still allows you to cancel the damage of a failed save once per game, which could be really quite big if you got hit by something enormous like, say, Necron Locust Heavy Destroyers. For its weapons, most people tend to use the Acid Spray for the Strength 6 and Damage 2 attack that can threaten some fairly punchy Overwatch. Maybe the Rupture Cannon might be the second choice after that. Just a couple of enormous anti-tank shots, though they are very, very swingy as to whether or not they penetrate enemy armor or not. For its downsides, I think it's mainly just a case of its points cost. Its damage output is very low at 245 points with whichever gun you give it, and in general, Tyranids players tend to fall back on things like Exocrines, Zoanthropes or Maleceptors for mainline damage dealers, versus the other ranged competition this guy doesn't get much of a look in. Overall, I'd rate him a 4 out of 10, could be a durable distraction, but just really doesn't have the firepower to justify his points cost right now. Hopefully he gets to go down in the next balance update. Next up we have the Norn things. The Norn Emissary is 290 points. Games Workshop's big new Hunter Killer and Destroyer bug, tasked to take down one enemy target at the exclusion of all other purposes. He's still got a very good defensive profile in his own right, getting 16 wounds at T11 and a 2 plus save, and he gets a 4 plus invulnerable save and 4 plus save against mortal wounds as well. And then on top of that, if you take the objective seeking special rule that he gets, on his nominated objective he gets a further 5 plus feel no pain, making him just spectacularly tanky there, and a big objective control 15, so if he's on that point you likely control it until he's dead. If it makes more sense for some reason, you could swap this durability boost for rerolls against one hard target, though I'd say it's maybe not quite as exciting for him given that his damage output is kind of low. Otherwise he's a Synapse creature, which could be interesting in Synaptic Nexus for the reroll stratagem. He's fairly fast moving at a 10-inch move, and being such a big chunky unit is quite a good focal unit for stratagems and any focal boost that you can use for him. His main weakness is damage output, where he just doesn't really do too much besides against medium infantry, at least not for the 290 point cost. He is also significantly easier to kill before he reaches that midfield objective if the opponent does get the Alpha Strike on him, and once he's there he might have to make difficult decisions as to whether he charges off it again to take down something else or whether he just holds the fort. Overall I think he's usable enough. I'd rate him an 8 out of 10 currently. Maybe a bit of a big investment, but can be a powerful thing just to hold down one objective point at the exclusion of all else. His dual build kits can build the Norn Assimilator. He lacks the Synapse and the Psychic, but instead makes up for it in raw damage, getting most of the same rules as the standard Norn Emissary, but swapping out his damage output for some Strength 12 ranged attacks with his harpoons, and much more threatening talons that can take down monsters and vehicles in close combat. Beyond that, he also gets a mortal wound damage rule if enemies fall back from him, which can be kind of meaningful at a big d6 mortal wounds. His main downside, I'd say, is that he's just not quite as tough. He lacks the 4+ invulnerable save, which is quite a big deal. High AP, AP3 and AP4 things are going to be far more effective against him. He also loses Synapse and is slightly pricier as well. In general, out of the two, people seem to slightly prefer the Norn Emissary over this guy. Though in reality, I don't think there's really all that much in it. He can definitely take down some enemy heavy hitters, which is a big advantage. Overall, I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10. Moving on, we come to the Spore Assist, and a mobile kind of Tyranid fortification that squats where it's been landed and pumps out mucilid spores. It's 145 points, and the main reason to take one is that it can spawn one of those spore units in per turn anywhere within 18 inches, handy enough for board control. Maybe a little bit of damage if the opponent approaches objectives when it's on it. Otherwise, it gets to fire Overwatch for 0 CP, but given that it doesn't really get any special rules for that, it only averages around 1 or 2 Strength 5 and Damage 2 hits, so it's not really all that much of an advantage. Overall though, this thing is just massively overcosted. It's a mobile monster, so it can't readjust lines of sight, must set up in your own deployment zone, and can't set up forward like some other similar fortification type things can. Its defense is surprisingly bad for the cost for a fortification. They tend to be rather tanky, but this thing really isn't. And perhaps worst of all, you have to choose between either shooting a mucilid spore out or firing its regular bioweapon shots, something that even if it could do both, it wouldn't be particularly exciting, and that just doubles down on making it about as useless as possible. Overall, at 145 points, I'd rank this a 2 out of 10. Spawning annoying spore mines is good, but the Biovore does it far better. This thing would have to come down a whopping amount of points before it would be particularly interesting, I think. Next, we've got the Tyranid drop pod in the Tyrannicide, 105 points for this thing. A monstrous transport unit that can drop units onto the board turn 1, allow them to get out and try and deal what damage they can, and then go on after that to be an annoying nuisance threat, hovering around taking off some pot shots with its biocannons, and potentially doing nuisance charges on enemy units with a monstery sort of profile. I feel like perhaps the biggest problem that this thing has though is that it needs units that needs to want to pay the big premium for first turn deep strike. And in reality I feel like there's just not really any Tyranid units that find that enormously exciting. Ideally it needs something that needs to get very close to shoot the enemy and then has massive damage output when it does, but it's perhaps kind of fragile and hard to get where it needs to be otherwise. I guess maybe Zoanthropes might be one of the things that fit that bill the best, though they generally tend to be fairly happy just hovering around the deployment zone and getting what lines of sight they can. Maybe Pyrovores could be interesting to put a surprising amount of weight and wounds down in the midfield. Overall though, it just doesn't really seem to see a lot of play, and given that it's a transport that pays a lot for its deep strike ability as its main draw, its damage and defense are pretty weak. Overall I've chosen to rate it a 5 out of 10. Genuinely not really all that bad between the first turn drop and then annoyance factor after that, but maybe just not really having the units that really need to pay for its special rules as a premium. Finally, for the monsters beyond characters, we get to the Tyranid flyers, and here we have the Harpy and the Hive Crone. The Harpy is 215 points, and is sort of a Tyranid fighter bomber type thing. A hover keyword flyer that can start on the board, moves around shooting things with its twin-linked bioweapons, bombing things with spore mines, and can potentially threaten things with charges at really quite a long distance if needed. Unfortunately though, it's just enormously overcosted at 215 points. Its durability is very bad for that kind of points cost, and even putting all three of its types of damage together, it just doesn't really amount to all that much. The spore mines are probably the most interesting thing, and they might be struggling to get in range of things. It actually needs to move over something, and that might be hard to do at 20-inch move, particularly turn 1. Otherwise, for this kind of points cost, its range and melee aren't really up to much. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 3 out of 10. Massive disadvantages without any major upsides in my opinion. I feel like the Harpy could easily drop something like 50 points before people would be particularly interested in it. Overall, I feel like it's maybe not too different for the Hive Crone either. It gets a bit of a trade around in value, getting slightly better melee than the Harpy does, given its thorax spur type thing. And instead of its ranged attack, it gets the dual cannon for 2d6 torrent hits, which is a fairly punchy flamer. The Tentaclids can threaten a bit of devastating wounds against vehicles, and it gets a +1 to hit against fly as well. Overall, it does have some interesting threats. Again, though, it does really have the same sort of problems as the Harpy. None of its numbers really add up as particularly exciting for 200 points. I might be inclined to rank it just a bit ahead of the Harpy, given the chance for Overwatch, and the fact that it costs 15 points less. I've chosen to rank it a 4 out of 10 overall. Finally, we get to the Tyranid characters that I've not mentioned yet. I've mentioned the Lone Operative ones in the Lone Operative section, and Old One Eye with the Carnifexes if you want to see them. Pressing onwards though, let's start with the Hive Tyrant, basically the Commander-in-Chief of Tyranid forces locally for the Hive Mind, possessing unknowing aiding and culling, and a massive frame with some powerful bioweapons to back that up. He's 235 points, so is a bit of a premium leader right now. He does bring some pretty helpful stuff to the board though. A free battle tactics stratagem on a Tyranid unit within 12 inches is quite nice and fairly flexible. That one feels particularly handy for the big 5+ feel no pain that you can get in Invasion Fleet. You can have that going off on 2 different targets per turn, or just 1 for free if you want to. Otherwise, he brings his Onslaught buff to the board, an aura of advance and shoots and making Tyranid weapons assault nearby. That's nice for quite a number of units, maybe Zoanthropes or the Maliceptor in particular, though it could be nice to get lines of sight for Exocrines as well. He provides Synapse as well, and then he also has his own combat stat line to back him up, some heavy venom cannon shooting at range, and some twin-linked bone sword attacks in close combat, a whole bunch of damage 3 there. As a big model, he can be quite an interesting one for enhancements. Anything that gives him more survivability in particular might be of interest. I think his big drawback is that he's really quite costly at 235 points, and with only 10 wounds at a 2+, 4+ invulnerable save, means that his durability really is not good at this kind of cost. If he gets focused by a whole bunch of enemy anti-tank firepower, he could get shot down depressingly quickly, and he could lose a very valuable monster early on. I guess in theory you could make use of Tyrant Guards to try and mitigate that, or just hide him behind some forward-looking pieces of terrain, but he still does seem to see some competitive play. Free stratagems are a big deal. Overall, I've chosen to rank him at a 7 out of 10. Definitely doesn't feel like an auto-include, but a high-value Tyranid that can be a pretty good commander for certain armies. Otherwise, you can also choose to field the Hive Tyrant with wings, 210 points for a flying Hive Tyrant, generally having a fair few similarities. The main differences are that it moves a lot faster, of course, and gets deep strike if you want it. It could get to combat really quite a lot quicker if needed, and actually put all those monstrous bone sword attacks to good use. Otherwise, he swaps his Onslaught boost for debuffing the enemy attack characteristic for one unit that he nominates in the fight phase. That could be quite good for defensive buff if he gets engaged in combat. Though perhaps the single most important thing that this guy has is the Vanguard Invader keyword, meaning that he's really quite an interesting unit in the Vanguard Onslaught, a really big, chunky and threatening unit that can use all their stratagems to maximum effect, plus their enhancements, and he can make use of that stratagem to prevent himself being shot at greater than 12 inches, which rather gets around his durability being fairly bad for the cost like the regular Hive Tyrants. I'd absolutely rate him a lot stronger there. Beyond Vanguard stuff though, he is a little bit more fragile than the Foot Tyrant with only toughness 9. It's kind of hard to hide those really big wing profiles, and he basically does have lower damage than the Walking Hive Tyrant as well. He has to choose between either getting a big gun or a serious melee attack and can't get both, and losing Onslaught isn't the best either, as that's quite a handy boost to have around. Overall, I've chosen to rank him at a 6 out of 10. That's more for armies that don't have a Vanguard Spearhead on the go. In Vanguard Spearhead, I'd probably put him more like an 8. Definitely a unit that's very detachment dependent. Next up, we've got the Tervagon, who's 190 points. This is a big tanky bug with a good durability at 16 wounds at toughness 11. And the Broodmother is here to look after her little charges, respawning D3+3 slain termagants into a depleted unit, which can be helpful to allow them to take objectives or reposition a bit better with some spawn models in the command phase. Otherwise, it provides synapse and lethal hits to units nearby, helpful for making them just a little bit more threatening against tougher enemies. And in general, I'd be most tempted to use the Tervagon in the Unending Swarm detachment, we're likely to have enough termagants on the board that it's going to matter. Perhaps the biggest weakness for the Turvigon is that it's going to stick out like a sore thumb if you are running an entire Horde army list and this is one of the only hard targets, or the big scary anti-tank guns are going to get sent its way. Its durability is kind of good, but not being able to be shielded by gaunt swarms anymore is a bit unhelpful for it. Otherwise, its actual range damage and defense for itself is really quite bad for the cost. And its gaunt replenishment special rule means that it's not going to be able to actually get used unless you've got a depleted squad of termagants nearby. If, say, it's your first turn and they've not taken damage, or the opponent fully wipes out a brood, then you're not going to be able to do anything with that. Overall, I feel like it could be worth it in the unending swarm, or if you've got a serious amount of termagants on the go. If not, then it's probably not going to be of all that much interest. I've chosen to rank the Turvigon as a 6 out of 10. Next up, we've got the spooky floating bug that is the Neurotyrant, 105 points for a sort of alpha zoanthrope, perhaps surprisingly cheap for something that in theory should be somewhat Hive Tyrant equivalent. The Neurotyrant has its special rule to make the Shadow of the Warp buff go off a little bit more threateningly, giving enemies a -1 to each of those tests, which makes it a lot more impactful. You might get something like an extra 2 or 3 enemy units failing due to that, which is pretty big. It's really quite good for handing out synapse and can do so at a long range with those neuraloid markers, and then it attacks nearby with a fairly punchy torrent attack, 2d6 at AP -1 and damage 2. If you want, you could give it guard type units like Neurogaunts or Tyrant Guard, though most people choose not to. It's really quite nice in Synaptic Nexus, where you can get the cheap enhancements to give it Strength 6 and AP -2 shooting. That makes it into seriously quite a good Torrent and Overwatch type threat, and it often seems to get used to hold down home field objectives for the Tyranid swarms. Quite nice to sit there nice and safe handing out its synapse and threatening some big Overwatch if anything tries to take the point. Overall, for weaknesses, it's not really got that great damage for the cost, though it's sort of a half and half offering, as you're basically paying a chunk of those points for better Shadow in the Warp, and with whatever's left it's going to be a very cheap monster, which does have genuinely okay damage and defense for that cost. They do seem to get played really quite frequently in competitive lists these days, more lists have them than don't, and overall I'd rate the Neurotyrant a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Quad Bone Sabers of the Hive Mind's Ultimate Strategist. The Swarm Lord is the epic hero version of the Hive Tyrant, and he brings an extra command point to the table generated each turn, debuffs an enemy battle tactic stratagem, which could be the command point reroll if you've got nothing better to use it on. Having that go to 2 CP could be disruptive late on, and then just brings its own melee profile into the game. Some torrent shooting really quite similar to the Neurotyrants, and then some fairly general purpose potent melee with 8 attacks at damage 3 and twin linked. He also gets a boosted synapse range, so not too bad to have in the heart of your army to push that out a bit further than it otherwise would be. At 270 points though, despite having some good abilities to bring to the table, he does feel overcosted. He is just as tough as the other Hive Tyrants, which means that he's spectacularly easy to kill for this cost. And in general, that probably means that you want him to play cagey for a turn or two to get some good use out of his command point things before committing him to the fray. Otherwise, CP generators can occasionally be a bit redundant. Say if you're bidding off tactical objectives, then you won't gain an extra one here, so its actual value might be a little bit lower than what it feels like on paper. The stratagem that he ruins is locked to battle tactics, so is better against some things than others. And just overall, his damage, defense and utility is just a bit overcosted right now. It was kind of surprising that Games Workshop put him up by quite this much. I think he could certainly go down a bit. Overall, I still think that he's maybe a little bit more credible than a lot of people make him out to be. Extra CP is huge, the stratagem thing can be very disruptive, and his damage isn't too bad. I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10 overall. In reality, he doesn't make it into virtually any competitive list due to his points cost. Next up, for some smaller characters, we've got the Winged Prime. He's the guy who was seen in the Leviathan box trailer ripping a Terminator limb from limb. He's 65 points for a Winged Warrior profile and gives you some sustained hits on your unit attacking, so makes them a bit more efficient, and can be potentially helpful for trying to shorten charge ranges on the enemy, as he gets a big movement so could range out the front of your unit and hopefully make enemies a bit easier to charge as a result. He can also give warriors Vanguard Invader and access to enhancements and things, which if you're building around them, both could be really quite big things. Or you could run him with Gargoyles, where he turns them from being just a cheap skirmisher type unit to something that could actually have a bit of melee threat. changing them from a unit that isn't really going to kill anything much to something that could fairly comfortably bully lighter infantry units is also the cheapest synapse that you can get in the army, which isn't really any bad thing either. For his downsides, both his damage and defense just aren't particularly exciting. Low AP and damage 2 isn't going to threaten things like vehicles or terminators, and his durability isn't good when he does get exposed. If his squad gets shot away, he doesn't get any invulnerable save. Overall, I'd say that just for utility though, he probably limps into around about a 7 out of 10 or so. Definitely way more viable than he used to be, now he's got a good points cut. Can be interesting in Vanguard Invader lists in particular. Finally, for the core Codex units, we've got the Broodlord. The Alpha Gene Stealer gets the same sort of boost as his main unit, moving 8 inches and able to scout into the midfield for some early charge threats. Having him in the unit makes them into a lot more of a general purpose threat. Lots of attacks with devastating wounds that reroll the wound roll at damage 2 are generally good news, and they're pretty much the sort of thing that you want to have against everything that Gene Stealers won't really be able to damage too well. He also gives his squad devastating wounds, and makes the enemy -1 to hit when he's in combat with them, and can allow you to get enhancements in the Gene Stealer unit if it's relevant. For the downsides, his damage and defense are still kind of okay, but like the Gene Stealers is paying a premium for his mobility. Devastating wounds got far less good after Gene Stealers no longer got the full wound rerolls that they had in the initial index version, and even with the 2 wounds that Gene Stealers have now, it's not a particularly tanky unit once you add this guy in. Not for, I guess, around 260 points for 10 guys and a character. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10. Again, one of the units that I'd rank a place or 2 higher in Vanguard Onslaught, when he gets far better stratagem support compared with other detachments. Finally, last but not least, we come to the Forge World units. 2 flavours of Hierodule, and then the 2 really big Titanic Tyranid units. The Barbed Hierodule is 340 points. That's got sort of a Tyrannifex type profile, but with 18 wounds. But unlike the Tyrannifex being very weedy in melee, it's actually genuinely very threatening with massive damage D3 plus 3 attacks, and at range it hits with a pair of biocannons with some fairly general purpose strength 9 damage 2 shooting that should be a good threat to medium or heavier infantry, and can suppress one enemy unit for a -1 to hit, which doesn't hurt. Overall, I'd say probably kind of okay for its stat line rather than massively stand out. I've chosen to give it a 7 out of 10. I've done the same for the Scythed Hierodule as well for 330 points. This one has an acid spray that can delete infantry fairly well, and then basically skews even further towards melee compared with the barbed one. It gets a couple of extra attacks there and is a little bit cheaper. Again, I've chosen a 7 out of 10 there. Probably would be more inclined to go 7 or a little bit lower. I could have fairly happily ranked these guys 6 as well. Otherwise, there's then the really big monsters, which definitely have some enormously threatening damage profiles. The Hierophant Biotitan gets 2 dire biocannons with a lot of strength 10, AP3 and damage 3 shots to tear apart enemy terminators or lighter vehicles, and then some pretty massive melee for anything it does manage to contact, with some strength 20 damage D6 plus 1 attacks with those big claws. It is a huge 810 points, so it's going to be taking up a massive slot out of, say, a 2000 point list, absolutely dominating one of those, but some armies just won't be able to handle the massive profile it puts on the board. 30 wounds at toughness 14 with a 2+ save just is going to stat check certain armies, perhaps particularly those that rely on las cannons quite a lot, where they're going to be wounding it on a 5. Still though, that many eggs in one basket could be bad news for the armies that can kill it, and even against ones that can't, sometimes it might just get outplayed on objectives if they focus the rest of the army. Terrain could also be a very big problem for it, given that it has a spectacularly big unit footprint. Unless you've got tables that are sort of thinking about this unit specifically, it might well not be able to move very far. I've chosen to rank it a 4 out of 10 between all that. In reality, not really all that competitive, but could genuinely surprise opponents in a more casual game where it's got terrain set up to allow it to function. Finally, there's the Harridan at 610 points, a similar sort of damage threat to the Hierophant, with massive biocannons that can move around the board quite quickly, plus a bit of melee, though not quite as threatening there. It can move 20 inches a turn, so it should be able to get line of sight on what it wants to, but on the flip side it is massively easier to take out compared with the Hierophant. Only toughness 10 and a 3+ save is far less hard to crack than toughness 14 with a 2+. And some focused dedicated enemy anti-tank firepower probably shouldn't have too much difficulty bringing this down. Having absolutely no objective control could be quite painful as well for something that's taking up a third of your points at a 2000 point game, Again, as a result, I've chosen to rank it as a 4 out of 10. Genuinely does have some very threatening damage, and some lists might really struggle to handle it, but overall probably not a good choice compared with just the sheer amount of monsters and things that you could get for a similar cost. So anyway, with the Forge World units talked about, that just about brings us to the end of our look through Codex Tyranids and all of the units contained within. Let me know your thoughts on each of the units and any of the rankings. Always happy to hear other opinions or takes. And let me know if there's any important strengths or weaknesses that you think I missed down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.